Welcome to everybody. We'll have a brief introduction and then we'll begin to discuss the paper, particularly focusing on the methodology adopted. I'm Joe Tidd, and today I'm in the capacity of the editor of the International Journal of Innovation Management, which is one of the journals that ISPIM publishes in. And I'll ask the other two participants to introduce themselves briefly.
Ladies first, as always.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, my name is Romana Rauter. I'm associate professor affiliated to the University of Graz in Austria, and I'm working in the field of sustainability and innovation management, and it's my pleasure to be here today. Thanks a lot for the invite. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot also for having us. Dietrich, you're watching my name. I'm working as a senior researcher here at the Alpen-Adria University in Austria in the Department of Innovation Management and Entrepreneurship, with my focus areas in sustainability innovation, organizational creativity, and radical innovation, and focused on quantitative research in that field, which I think will be quite some part of our conversation here. So I'm glad to be here.
Okay, thank you very much. Just very briefly, ISPIM will be moderating the chat area, and they will be then presenting those questions to us, and we'll discuss those in real time if we can. If not, we'll finish off at the end and mop up all those questions. So please, I encourage you to start to chat and question as we proceed. Okay, I'd like to start with a broad question, which I sort of personally and also with colleagues like to ask is sort of which came first? Was it your interest in the specific research questions in terms of sustainability performance, or was it really that you had a sort of toolkit, a preferred methodology, and you were seeking some application of that toolkit?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for this question. I'd like to start here. And in this case, it was clearly, first of all, our research interest and then the research gap identified and the questions that followed as a consequence. And why was that so? Why is it like that? Like investigating questions like this one that we addressed here in this paper can be considered kind of an interdisciplinary approach still. So it's the linkage, the interface between innovation and sustainability, and the interest in this topic has been increasing recently. And still, we already know a lot coming from either the innovation sphere or the sustainability sphere, but bringing those issues together and explore more details in this area requires kind of such a setting, or such a setting can be suitable to identify or to answer questions in this setting. So it was clearly the interest and the research question first.
Okay, thank you. Dietrich, do you want to add to that?
No, but actually almost everything has been said. So, but maybe just two words from me on that. So clearly the question was first. I know that's not always the case. It should be like that all the time, but sometimes it's more of, well, having a preference for a certain method and stick with it because you have, gained a lot of knowledge and reputation in a certain quantitative or qualitative research setting and stick to that. But since our research question was interested in, success factors rather than best practices, actually a more quantitative approach was more suitable for that kind of question. So it was really the question driving the method and not the other way around.
Okay, that's really good. Thank you for that clarification. I mean, following on from that, it's quite interesting that you've chosen to use quite, in some ways, quite conventional approaches in terms of a sort of cross-sectional survey-based instrument, and then use regression analyses. You go beyond that, and we'll discuss that later in terms of developing indices and measures, and that's very interesting. But can I ask a question? Why didn't you consider, or maybe you did consider and reject the idea of using some sort of structural equation modeling, because it's terribly popular at the moment? SEM is almost the go-to on the quant side, and obviously multiple case studies on the qualitative side. So can I ask you, firstly, did you consider SEM and reject it, and if so, on what basis? And why did you choose primarily to use a cross-sectional survey data instrument and then a sort of least squares regression?
That's a very good question. Having multi-items and then boiling it down to a regression analysis sounds like a step back. However, and we certainly will go a little bit deeper into our core construct, sustainability, innovation, performance that we developed newly. Actually, this way how we conceptualized it caused us to go back to OLS regression. So because we had these type 2 second order factor model conceptualization of sustainability, innovation, performance, that helps us to learn more about how to, what's the, let's say, mental model behind this concept. Well, this kind of formative constructs, you can't really integrate into a structural equation model as a mediator. So being influenced by certain variables and influencing others, because since we have formative indicators at a higher order for this sustainability, innovation, performance, actually, well, the entire variance of this variable is already explained by its antecedents, by its formative indicators. So this is the reason why you can't implement this into a structural equation model, such as in covariance or variance space. So because it's in this mediating position, and that's the reason why we couldn't do that. However, we still applied the structural equation model for the validation of the sustainability, innovation, performance construct. And we also performed the confirmatory factor analysis for the remaining reflective multi-item scale. So we didn't skip that part in terms of the validation of the measures, but for the main model analysis for this mediation model, we had to go back for the specified reasons.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so let's return, before we discuss in more detail the sort of two-factor model and the index that you produce, which I think is the most novel and innovative part of the method that you adopted, and also part of your subsequent findings. Let's begin, if you like, with the more existing literature which you draw upon to develop some of the factors, particularly the independent variables. So one of the questions I had was, why did you choose the sort of competing values framework from the literature, where you take, in your case, 4 types of culture, or archetypes of culture, rather than adopting a multi-dimensional measure of culture? So from what I understand, the competing values, it sort of follows up more a sort of structural approach to culture, following Mintzberg and others. So you get the sort of different archetypes, whereas other approaches see culture as multi-dimensional and therefore focus on the dimensions themselves rather than aggregating them up into archetypes. So why did you choose as your primary sort of independent variables the 4 archetypes for culture?
Romano, would you like to start with that one?
Yes, I can. So first of all, as previously shortly explained already, we were interested in kind of the underlying mechanisms within organizations. So this was first of all the reason for choosing the organizational culture as one factor of that was in the focus of our interest, to kind of explore and show the linkages between this cultural disposition and then, as said already, the dependent variables, sustainability, innovation, performance. And secondly, this construct or the framework itself has been used quite often and regularly in various types of research studies. So therefore, it offered us a conceptualization which we could draw upon our own study. And thirdly, with this kind of first indication of 4 different archetypes, it was helpful in a way to characterize some disposition and characteristics and to kind of show or demonstrate that was our idea, kind of differences in between those types, and to learn more about whether and how they actually kind of influence sustainability, innovation, performance. But Dietfried, you would like maybe to add more on that?
Yeah, well, the beauty of the competing values framework is that it has these archetypes, and these archetypes embodies so many different aspects, like what's the dominant level of control, what's the bonding, what's the strategic emphasis, do you have more of an internal, external orientation? And so if we would have had to investigate all of these separate cultural factors, this would, from a research design, actually would not have been possible. Because we would actually have to, each of these cultural single aspects would have needed to be operationalized in a separate scale. So therefore, these competing value frameworks and the archetypes actually allow us to really investigate a bunch of different cultural characteristics. And since the competing values framework is also, from an empirical standpoint, heavily investigated and very valid, this was the choice to go for. And it's quite of a new topic. So starting with archetypes is probably the, let's say, first way to go. And the next step would actually then be to go deeper into very specific cultural aspects, to dive deeper into the functioning and the relevance of very specific cultural aspects on achieving sustainability, innovation, performance.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so we come to, I think, one of the most interesting, in my view, and certainly the most novel aspects of this paper, and that's the development of the measure, or rather the index for sustainability, innovation, performance. And I think this is the really the core of the paper in terms of its contribution, other than the empirical results. So perhaps you can talk us through where that idea came from, because I think it's really quite novel, rather than the archetypes we just discussed, where you're pulling them from existing literature and relying on other empirical studies to, if you like, validate that choice of variable, whereas this is, I think, a novel contribution in terms of methodology. So where did this come from, this idea of this index for sustainable innovation performance? And particularly, I'm interested in this the idea of the type 2 factor model that you apply.
I start again. So what actually was one of our shared research interests is actually how or whether we can kind of define or show and demonstrate potential results of innovation activities that link to this concept of sustainability. And following these considerations and also ongoing discourse in literature as well as in practice, I need to say, we were reflecting upon, as I just said, how and whether this can be also operationalized and captured. And starting doing so, we considered, of course, existing works in these fields. And we know a lot already, so to say, what are similarities, and on the other side, also differences between kind of conventional types of innovations with a clear focus on economic aspects. Maybe first, in And by also like saying or stating that then sustainability oriented innovations or sustainable innovations differ in that sense, given the fact that they are considered to be more complex, for instance, requiring more or also different types of collaborations also with partners external to the organization, and so on and so forth. And during this process, we also found out that while the performance measurement of innovations in an economic sense is also very well established already, we observed that there is kind of a gap. So there was a clear lack of a metric that we would have considered to be helpful or supportive in our research study to capture what I just said, namely essentially the contributions of innovations also in regard to sustainability, which comprises environmental dimensions as well as social dimensions. So this was our starting point content-wise.
Right, and this was where the journey began, and this was a real nail biter because actually, you know, the term innovation is used so frequently, and it's, you know, Professor Gemünden once said it's not the term innovation, it's innoflation. So everybody uses it all the time, and currently we have pretty much the same happening with sustainability. And the question that we had to answer is, well, what is sustainability, innovation, performance actually meaning to people? So, and you know, if you ask somebody, how do you define sustainability, and then ask another person, you will certainly get different responses. And so therefore we had to find out what is the mental model. We had to decompose that. And in quantitative research, actually, this is an approach you can use to actually get to the core, what is meant by that. And this is why this type 2 second order factor model comes in. And I explained briefly how we did it. So the first step was basically we built a set of items based on the literature, such as Romana said, to find out what are sub-dimensions that could be relevant. And this kind of set of items we gave the participants of the study actually to rate. And by using explorative factor analysis, we could actually boil it down to what are the main dimensions that people perceive when they think and rate their sustainability innovation performance. And we resulted in 4 of them. So, you know, the product design, process efficiency, environmental pollution, and social responsibility. But that's driven from the empirical results. So this was not our initial hypothesis, although they are pretty much the same as in the literature. But now we had empirical validation that, okay, these are the 4 dimensions. And in the next step, we wanted to know, okay, well, is there one of these dimensions that is basically more important than others when rating the overall sustainability innovation performance? And this is where these, and I admit, not really well diffused type 2 second order factor model comes into the game. So which is, in a nutshell, that you have this higher order construct of sustainability innovation performance that is defined by its underlying formative constructs, basically, you know, the 4 dimensions I've mentioned before. And each of these dimensions can have, and that's also something you find out through empirical methods, might have a different weight in this overall evaluation. And this is what you do with this kind of partial least square approach. There are others as well that we can touch on later on. But where you actually really, from a structural modeling point of view, build this higher order factor model and estimate what the overall contribution of each dimensions to this higher order factor is. And what the result is basically, to illustrate that, what we found out is that basically these environmental and social responsibility dimensions were driving the overall index even more than the product design and process efficiency dimensions. So again, this kind of approach and this newly, this kind of alternative conceptualization of the sustainability innovation performance construct helped us to learn more about the actual mental model underlying our dependent variable, and helps to better understand how it's decomposed.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, one of the challenges where you have a sort of what you call a type 2 factor model, or a sort of composite index that you're developing. And also in terms of your more conventional independent variables on the 4 archetypes for culture, is, who do you target your questionnaire to? If you ask 50 people in an organization of 50 what their culture is, you'd probably get 50 different answers maybe. So, one of the questions I have is, how did you deal with, well, firstly, how did you choose the type of respondent? Because in your study, for each firm, you had 2 respondents, an R&D or technical manager, and a higher, broader responsibility like a CEO or general director and such like. So first question, how would you target those? And how between those 2 people did you reconcile any differences of interpretation of the questionnaire?
So yeah, indeed, we did a multiple respondent design. So actually the dependent variable, so the performance evaluation was done by a high levels executive. The reason for that was, well, they're having the best overview. They are responsible for the overall firm performance. So therefore they were selected as the ones to be best knowledgeable about that. And about the practices and the innovation related aspects that we asked in the other part of the survey, we asked these R&D and innovation managers, also high ranked in their organization. The reason for that was, well, they are most knowledgeable about the practices that are happening there. So this was a part of a larger research project. We also asked people about the open innovation activities, about the use of formal and social control, and the cultural aspects. And by having the dependent and independent variables collected from different respondents, we actually could overcome the problem, or the typical problem, of single respondent designs of endogeneity. So that we, asking a set of questions and then asking about the performance, there might be some kind of spillover effect, and that is quite difficult to control in data. So we have resolved this by separating it. But you mentioned a very good point. So when we talk about fact-based items, of course, they are reducing the likelihood that asking 5 people, you get 5 totally different responses. So the items of the competing values framework are formulated as statements, as facts, and people could agree or disagree to that. But that's indeed one, let's say, limitation of our research, that we don't have data on each of these constructs from several people within the organization to triangulate if they have the same opinion or the same evaluations. So this is something that we couldn't control due to research limitations, but by drawing on established scales for the cultural and economic performance variables, we at least could eliminate the problem of having, well, both single respondents and new items for each construct.
Okay, Romana, do you have anything to add?
No. Very
Okay.
well explained.
Okay, if I can ask a question, follow-on question from that. You mentioned that one of the benefits of the multi-respondent per organization approach is you get around some of the issues of using common source bias, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and which is one of the big weaknesses of all these survey-based interpretations of different questions and such like. Were there any other tests that you did to try to check for the common source bias? Because it's terribly important when you have a model where you have some sort of independent variables, and then you have the dependent variable, some sort of performative outcome, to try to have some either controls and or tests to minimize that. And there are lots of studies which I think have been undermined by the fact that whether they're single or multiple respondents are based on those qualitative assessments and then make performative judgments using cross-sectional data. So did you do any other checks or tests to check for that?
Yeah, there were 2 different things that we did. So the first thing is that our main model, so when having the regression model specified, we actually also included certain controls, so that we avoided the problem that, you know, there are certain background factors that were not measured that actually caused the result to be produced. So this kind of a control variable approach, so to overcome this issue with the endogeneity. And a second thing is, well, there are a few measurement or let's say what is it called, measurement free or measure free control procedures, such as the Gauss-Coppola approach, where you actually can test if there is some background factor or some overlapping factor that might cause this relationship to be significant, although it is not. It might be some kind of latent, unknown background factor that is actually causing the relationship. So these kind of issues you can overcome by, you know, running a lot of additional analysis post hoc. But the best way, of course, is in the first place to have data from different respondents collected. So that's how we approached it. And we did the Gauss-Coppola approach. So we implemented that for the second part of the mediation model. So for sustainable innovation performance, economic innovation performance relationship, where we had both answers from the same respondent. And it turned out that the Gauss-Coppola terms were all insignificant, meaning that there was, at least from that post hoc analysis, not really an indication that we have this kind of common source bias in there. Okay. But ideally, we would have secondary data, of course, but when it comes to innovation activities and especially innovation performance, it's really hard to get.
Yeah, and it's also very hard to match your sample with published data, for example, on sustainability outcomes or innovation outcomes. So I understand that. Romana, do you have anything to add to?
No, I initially just wanted to highlight this potential use of secondary data, which we still consider to be not fully applicable for questions like these ones.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, let's move on to your sample choice. I think in the paper you said it was drawn randomly from a larger data set, and then you use some MBA students to do some of the heavy lifting and contacting them and trying to get cooperation. We've all been there and done that. So my question is less about the logistics of doing that, which I think is quite well understood. It's more about how that final sample, those who agreed to participate, was composed and how that relates to some of your control variables that you had in there. You had control variables on market turbulence, technology turbulence, things you'd expect to be in there. But when I looked at the final sample, it seemed to be quite heavily biased towards things like automation, engineering and such like. So you didn't, and it's not a criticism, it's just a question, you didn't have anything like pharmaceuticals where you'd have very high levels of basic research uncertainty and such like. So some questions around this sort of final sample composition and what it can or can't tell us about the effects of some of the controls like market turbulence and particularly technology turbulence.
Yeah, so we have, of course, limitations. So the companies that participated, well, although in terms of the distribution, we have a little bit of bias into the automation direction, but the others are quite within, let's say, the Austrian average. Including that into the main regression analysis at least allows us to control for industry differences in the main model. But since we had so many different industries in there, it was not really possible to include, a dummy variable for each of them. So we had to find some sort of proxy that captures these industry differences. And as you mentioned before, we tried to capture this with this market turbulence and the technology turbulence. So how fast customer needs change or competitive landscapes change, which is different for each and every industry, as well as how fast technological progress works and technological change is in each of the industries. So that we, at the end of the day, don't end up with 25 different dummy variables that are pretty difficult to estimate in a regression model at the end of the day, especially if you have just 2-3 companies for a specific industry or by industry, and use these market and technological turbulence as the proxy variables to capture the industry differences in some way. And of course, firm size in terms of I think employees that we use also capture this kind of company-specific differences. It is some kind of a workaround, although most use that, but the industry differences need to be included and controlled for in the regression model. And well, we use this turbulence data for that. That's
and I think that's laudable, given, you know, as you said, some of the industries are underrepresented and some are overrepresented. So I think taking that broader approach, particularly when you're looking at things like innovation, sustainability, so looking at trying to capture some of that turbulence, which we know from the literature we would expect to have some effect on innovative behaviors, although in this case it wasn't one of the major findings, so it wasn't meant as a criticism there. Okay, can we move on?
And just one word to that. So it's more about, you know, finding what are the commonalities across these industries, right? And
sure.
To make it operationalizable. That's the point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think too many studies focus on individual industries or think certain industries are very unique. But I think if you look at the literature, particularly in terms of innovation, I'm less sure about sustainability, but certainly in terms of innovation, there are different underlying factors even within the same industry. You get some firms are facing highly turbulent technologies and markets, and others not so. So I'm not sure industries a better way of categorizing these things. Could we move on to some of the sort of headline results and how we might interpret those? So if you sort of turn the handles on the regressions, some of your hypotheses are supported, others not, or not in the right direction or the expected direction, and that always makes for an interesting study rather than all the hypotheses being confirmed as if the paper were written backwards. So it's always quite, seriously, it's always quite a relief as an editor or even as a researcher to read something that the literature would lead you to expect, but the findings challenge that, if I can put it that way, or at least challenge some of those expectations rather than just sort of ticking and confirmation such like, which always makes me suspect that the hypotheses are written after the event. But in this case, we had a couple of hypotheses. For those who haven't read the paper yet, I'd encourage you to do so. Is essentially that the clan structure was seen to have a negative effect, basically, and that effect was stronger, I believe, when you put in firm size as well. So that was quite a very interesting, but to some extent expected hypotheses that was confirmed. The other hypotheses in terms of the different archetypes were more mixed, and some were in the opposite direction that you might expect. So if you could just very briefly discuss particularly the surprises in terms of hypothesis testing. So for example, in terms of the effects of hierarchy and market archetypes in terms of the measured outcomes for sustainability innovation.
I start, and then Dietrich, you might want to continue. So thanks for the question, and you were also putting it in the direction that I directly pick up this market and hierarchy issue, and I will start with that. So as you said already initially, and this was also shown in our hypothesis, or that's what we actually considered when based on the literature and before analysis, is that a market culture, so an organization, be very much kind of oriented toward the market and the external environment, so to say, that this will kind of negatively impact sustainability innovation performance. And the similar or the same actually hypothesis was raised for the hierarchy culture. So in hierarchy cultures, which also display a strong or a high degree of control, as well as a stronger internal than external orientation, we were also assuming that this hinders those types of cultures, meaning organizations, to actually, for instance, being aware of trends, so to say, ongoing in the external environment. Such sustainability can be considered as one. And then that's what you said too already. After the analysis of the data, our findings actually showed something different or slightly different. So especially this hierarchy culture type and the relationship to sustainability related innovation performance was significant but positive instead of negative. And of course, we started also to ask ourselves this question: what has been happening, or why does this effect is different than expected? And we came to the conclusion that in such an organization which is characterized by a hierarchy culture, especially decision makers and the top management level plays a very crucial role in there, in a positive way also. So if topics such as sustainability in general are considered to be very important, such types of organizations have already mechanisms and structures in place that help also kind of to apply and to communicate sustainability issues internally too. So in short, this was one explanation for the effect of hierarchy culture. And for the market culture, Dietrich, do you want to continue?
Yeah, sure. So for the market culture, actually, well, there was not really any effect shown in the data, meaning that the market culture doesn't really facilitate more sustainability, innovation, performance, but also doesn't hamper it. And that's also interesting. And maybe our view on that was more of, well, maybe there are two forces that are actually at the end of the day lifting any kind of effect in a positive or negative. Which is, well, on the one hand, market cultures are very short-term focused, efficiency driven, and external driven, external orientated. So what the competition and the customers are doing, that's the one thing to go for. And so on the one hand, this market cultures, it's not really coming from top down or somewhere that sustainability should be something implemented. On the other hand, it is coming from the customers and the competition, actually, that if there are some major trends towards sustainability, and we just need to have a look at the newspaper and we see that that's clearly the case, that they still catch up on these trends. So they are not behind the curve and do not leave out any kind of possibility and opportunity, or in other terms, don't have a competitive disadvantage by not going after sustainability related matters in their innovation activities. So on the one hand, it's not their internal DNA to become more sustainable, as it might be the case for other cultural archetypes. But on the other hand, with this strong external focus, they still catch on if it becomes a competitive important factor. So that's how we can explain why market orientation, or this market orientated culture does not really have an impact on doing more, but also not causing any kind of disadvantage when it comes to sustainability, innovation, performance.
Okay, I mean, I guess there's different ways to interpret both your specific findings and more generally. The easy life is to have hypotheses that are all supported or clearly negated. That's the easy life. You had two that basically were supported, adhocracy and the clan in different directions. You had the hierarchy, which was the reverse to what you expected, and you just, Ramona just explained your interpretation of that. And then we had the market construct archetype, which was more ambiguous, I would say. And it reminded me of the early studies on leadership member exchange, LMX, between, you start off with a couple of simple archetypes of leadership, and then you look at the effects and such like, and over several iterations on that, you need finer grained archetypes, and then you break it down into the dimensions, and you realize some of these things aren't working terribly well. So it's hard, I think, at this stage to figure out, particularly with the market archetype, is it a weakness of that construct, or is it that you have at least two things happening within that market, as you just explained, Dietfried, where you've got the external pressures, sort of bandwagons or peer pressure effects on the one hand, in the other hand, you have no strong top-down leadership, and these two are in some sort of tension, if you like. So a very interesting finding. Okay, I'm going to see if we've got any questions from the group. I don't have anything. Oh, still no questions. So good. Is that good? I don't know. Anyway, okay. So I'd like to ask the final question, really, and to go slightly beyond the standard journal paper where you say, what are the limitations of my work? And you make sure they're not too bad, so you get through peer review, and then you say further research, which is really other people can do that and or seek funding. So not simply the things that you publish in the paper, but if you had the chance to replicate or extend the study yourselves, what would you do differently with the benefit of the knowledge that you have?
So from a method point of view, I would actually try to have a few more cases so that it would be possible to run these type 2 second order factor model validation not in partial least square, but in a covariance-based structural equation modeling approach, so in Lisrel or in Amos. Because the problem is, or the limitation of partial least square is that you actually have the assumption of error-free measurement, which is something where in structural equation modeling that is covariance-based, you actually have the error term and the measurement error and clearly separated. Yeah, and I think that's a limitation that requires, of course, a larger sample, but would actually also help in the next step to validate this further. And then it would actually be possible to not run this kind of phantom variable approach that we did. So have a simple reflective operationalization of our sustainability, innovation, performance, and this 4-factor model. But we could actually run a mimic model, which is also from a methodological establishment more established, let's say like that, and more common, and has also been adapted in a lot of scale validation papers in the past to actually get this type 2 second order factor model validated even a little bit better. We had to work with what we have, so this kind of 90 cases was multi-responder design was quite a lot to get, and well, maybe investing a little bit more time and collecting a few more cases would have enabled us to go one step further from the method perspective. That would be one thing besides a lot of other stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Ramona?
Another thing to mention, but anyway, it's in continuation of what you just said, and we discussed it earlier. So we collected data in Austria, so there were clear kind of boundaries in terms of geographical setting, as well as kind of the wider societal culture background. So of course, if resources were not an issue at all, we would have wished for like kind of exploring not only more cases, as it was just said, but also to continue the study, or to run or to do a similar study also in other contexts. So especially when it comes to the inclusion of sustainability into the innovation discussion, two concepts come together, which offer room, so to say, also for kind of critical reflection and discussion, and both are dependent on certain viewpoints to a certain extent, also in a business context. So this question of what do we understand, how do we define innovation, and now more sustainability oriented innovation, how to operationalize, how to capture it and measure it as well. Of course, this offers room for a lot of following research, and as I just said, also in other geographical areas, for instance. So this has a focus on Austria and Europe respectively, but yeah, we would have loved also to conduct such a study, for instance, in a country of the global south, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's two, to summarize there, I think there's two really, really interesting generalizable, if you like, next steps for yourselves and other researchers. One is, as you said, I think the sustainability innovation sort of nexus, or whatever you want to call it, I think there's a lot of scope for more work crossing those different disciplinary areas, partly because, as you said earlier on, they're both poorly defined or broadly defined, and they don't talk to each other enough. Often they're antagonistic. One tends to be more commercial, one tends to be more societal. So I think that's one big contribution and something that's a very fertile field for further research. And in terms of methodology, I agree entirely. I think we need collectively to do more work on trying to understand errors in measurement and how we incorporate those in studies, particularly survey-based studies and such like, in a sort of Bayesian sense. So I think those two sort of methodological and also disciplinary conclusions, I think we will stop there. And I would like to thank all of our participants, and I would encourage you to look at some of the previous methodology sessions from ISPIM, and to stay tuned, if that's the right term on the internet, for further installments over the next few months. I thank you all. Goodbye.